All right. Well, welcome today. And so glad you took time out of your day to have this conversation with us. This discussion is so important. And oftentimes, when I speak about how do you develop a nonprofit board, folks often are like, why is the HR person talking about this? The reality is how your board works together and how your board operates has a direct impact on your team and your organization. So organizations that are not thinking about their board as part of the broader team often will find that there are missteps or challenges later down the road, and sometimes miss the opportunity to understand the impact that that can have on your employees. To give everybody a little bit of perspective as to where my background comes from and why I can even talk about board development, everybody knows my HR background and that I spent my entire career in corporate HR until 10 years ago when starting the firm. But the experience on the board side is actually a little bit different and unique for me. I started working as a volunteer in nonprofit space right out of college. I had the opportunity to serve on several national boards that were everything from a working board where we're making the posters at night for the event the next day to more governing boards where we're setting strategy and longer term vision. And through those experiences, quickly realized that all of the things that I teach in terms of team development and team dynamics probably come through tenfold when it comes to working with board of directors, and the impact that it can have on your staff is really important to understand and recognize. And so as I started the firm, I was able to couple both my volunteer experience and understanding of governance and how boards work with, on the flip side, being able to talk about it in terms of how do you put great HR processes and tools in place that help support your staff and your board members so that it can have only positive impacts as we go. So all of this information that I'm going to share is really a combination of what we often teach in team development, but applies it to the nonprofit space by also bringing in some governance best practices and understanding how those two come together. I love to start in terms of thinking about what is teamwork, because we often start working with teams and we're like, the team will just come together as we go. It takes time. And the reality is teamwork is very much a strategic choice that we make up front of what do we want our teams to look like? How do we want them to operate together? And your board is part of the bigger team, and it's a really important part of it. In addition to that, nonprofit space has a unique challenge in that, right, folks, most of the folks on volunteer or on board of directors for nonprofits are volunteer based. So it's in addition to their day job. They don't sit next to each other and only focus on this particular organization most of the day, right? So their interactions can often be sporadic, inconsistent, by the very nature of, right, it's only at board meetings. We're not always having a lot of interaction outside of that. And so oftentimes nonprofits will completely forget about the idea of how do you build a team within your board so that that team can operate at the highest level possible. And then they are concerned when all of a sudden we're showing up to have hard conversations as a board and people are uncomfortable really diving deep into the important topic that's sort of the elephant in the room. Or on the flip side, they dive into that elephant in the room and they talk about it, but they do it in a way that doesn't leave either other board members or staff members truly feeling safe to explain kind of their perspectives or give their voices. And either of those outcomes becomes particularly challenging. So as we talk today about how do you create a successful board and really help develop that, we're going to focus our attention in three key areas. First of all, we're going to talk about role clarity. And it's interesting, if any of you have seen some of my presentations on how do you just create an effective team, this concept of role clarity is really big when you're talking about your staff, but often gets forgotten when we're talking about how it impacts your board of directors. And so we're going to talk today around what does role clarity within a board of directors look like? Why does it matter? And how do you get there? Then we're going to talk about this concept of trust. And again, this is really critical because and yet the most commonly overlooked component of how a board works together. And so we're going to talk about how do you build trust in this board development space, and how do you help your board members understand that at the end of the day, like, this actually matters. Building your team and spending time on developing trust makes a difference, even though this is a volunteer on the side type of thing for most folks in nonprofit world. And then the last piece we're going to talk about is how can we actually engage our board in healthy conflict. This concept is built along the lines of Patrick Lencioni, a great writer and author in leadership development. But Lencioni talks about the fact that teams that engage in healthy conflict are far more likely to actually move the needle and get the outcomes that they're looking for. But because we don't know each other well and trust may not be as high and we're not sure it's our place, sometimes when we get into volunteer world, again, we either avoid the conflict altogether or we engage in conflict, but it doesn't turn out feeling healthy. And so as we go through this today, we're going to talk about what does that mean and look like, and more importantly, how do you think about where are the places within your board that you could be having an even more impactful outcome if your board was engaging in healthy conflict on a more consistent and regular basis. And I'll explain what that word conflict means, because a lot of times as we go through this, people are like, oh, I thought we were supposed to be like, why would we be saying bad things to each other? And in Lencioni's model, conflict is not saying bad things to each other. It's about having crucial conversations in a way that's productive. So we're going to start our conversation with this idea of role clarity and what does that mean at the board level. And then I'll break down the other two areas as we go along. Right? When we think about role clarity, oftentimes we have organizations that have lines and right, they look more like these bottom two photos, right? You've got lines and pictures and dotted lines all over the place, and there's a lot of confusion. And when that happens, you end up with teams who are kind of ready to strangle each other because nobody really understands how my information falls in. I either get frustrated or I hold back because I don't want to disrupt things. On the flip side, when organizations have clear structure, like the upper left-hand corner, right now, everybody understands how they contribute, where they add value, who they need to consult with, and suddenly the whole team starts to row together. And so it's really important that, particularly for board of directors who aren't, again, they're not in the day-to-day of the organization, they have to understand their role and the role of the individuals on staff so that they don't start out of the goodness of their heart working on a project or running through with an idea only to find out that that disrupted or maybe even undermined a work that a staff member is trying to accomplish. But if we don't ever establish the roles for the board, more or less the roles for the staff, you'll run into a lot of situations where one or the other feels like they haven't been respected the way that they should, or that they've wasted time doing something that wasn't theirs to do in the first place. So defining for a board, like, why does role clarity matter if you're just simply volunteering your time? The really big piece of this is about decision efficiency, right? If I have to, pendulums can swing way too far one direction or the other. If I'm unsure if I'm the decision maker, then I might go out and gain input from 20 different people who really aren't supposed to be part of the conversation, but then are upset when their opinion wasn't taken, right? On the flip side, I can swing the pendulum too far the other direction and not get input from people along the way. And then I move forward quickly, but I've upset everybody that's coming behind me. And so some of the role clarity for the board helps people understand, when is the executive director the decision maker? When is the board the decision maker? When does the board maybe just give input, but the executive director really gets to make that call? And it gets really difficult and confusing because governance is a big part of nonprofit space that most volunteers don't have a good knowledge of. And that's okay, they're not expected to. But if we don't have that role clarity, then it becomes really hard for them to know how to operate. Also, this role clarity helps tremendously on communication. I need to know who needs to know what and when so that we don't end up all the way ready to roll out a project only to find everybody else is still kind of in the dark and unsure as to what's going on. Just had one the other day where a board made a decision and they had plenty of time to have consulted somebody. They viewed the change that they were implementing as super positive, and to be quite honest, for 98% of the people it really was a positive change. So they didn't communicate that they were talking about it. They didn't communicate that the change was coming. They make a vote, and everybody, even people that were positively impacted by the change, were wildly upset that there hadn't been any consultation, and because they didn't even know it was something that was on the table. And so understanding when people need to be consulted and when they need to be informed can be super helpful in that space. Also, role clarity plays a role in making sure you have the right people in the right roles. Yes, we are all we are volunteers when we are on a board of directors, but it doesn't mean you don't still have to make sure that you have the right skills at that table. I have a board of directors that is supposed to be acting like a governing board, but the individuals sitting on the board don't have the experience to think strategically, and that still makes them great people and very passionate, but they've not done strategic level work in the workplace. And so how are they going to do that in an organization that they're volunteering for? And because the roles are unclear, nobody knew to think about that when we started picking our board of directors. And so making sure now that we train those folks to be effective in that way is an important piece. And then most importantly is sort of trust and healthy conflict. We're going to talk a lot about that today and how that plays into whether or not your board is able to accomplish the goals that you need to have accomplished. One of the important things when we're talking about board of directors to understand is we often think about well, we'll do these kinds of things, and this is what this board will do, and this is what another board will do. And we don't know that there's actually a body of work out there that already exists that if you leverage it can help you figure out what type of board should we be. And we get a lot of organizations that every volunteer kind of shaped their own role, right? Like, oh, I'm a committee chair and I know what that means at this other organization I volunteer for. So I'll come do that role here. But if we're not aligned on the type of board we're supposed to be first, it would be really easy for people to misunderstand what they're supposed to do. So the American Society for Association Executives, or ASAE, has done quite a bit of work in this space to define what are the 6 most common board types that you need to be aware of. And figuring out from this, then, what type of board are you supposed to be is a super important piece. Now, there are some hybrid versions of this because as you grow as an organization, you will need to make shifts. But these are the general 6 kind of starting points. I'm going to talk through all 6 of these. I'm going to spend the most time on these first 2 because they're the ones we see most commonly. The first one is this concept of a working board. And in a working board, typically a working board is what you have if you don't have any staff or you have a very small staff. And what a working board means is, yes, you are setting direction for the organization, but because there's no staff, you also have to be part of day-to-day activities of the organization, right? So this is we might decide that we need to have an event targeted at this particular audience. And then as a board member, I am also creating the flyer for this event and doing all of the work to get that event to come to light. That is very much a working board, and the right role for a volunteer in that space is to take on responsibility for execution as well as setting strategy. On the flip side, a governing or strategic board is very different and often is confused because if I've always been on a working board, then I think I'm supposed to be involved in the nitty-gritty of the details. The example I often use is, right, a working board would probably have a discussion around what font size are we using on the website because they're probably the ones creating the website. A governing or strategic board, and ASAE uses those terms interchangeably, but a governing or strategic board, first of all, has an executive director on staff. Also typically has an executive director that has some staff to offload work to, so that the executive director isn't simply operational in nature. And their main goal in this case is actually to set direction. So envision the future state, see where we're going, and communicate that with the executive director of this is the long-term vision, and then step back and allow the executive director to lead the staff to accomplish those goals. The governing or strategic board should never be having a conversation about the font size of the website, right? That is staff level work. Boards should, however, be thinking about, right, who do we want to make sure is our target audience for the website, because that's setting the scope of the work of the organization. And then they hand that off to the executive director, and the executive director says, great, if that's who I'm targeting, here's how we're going to target this, and here's how we're going to accomplish that goal. The third kind of board is an advisory board. I always tell folks, if you get to sign up for one of these, you should, because it's really easy. You get to give a lot of opinions and then walk away after lunch and be like, I did my duty. Whereas governing boards tend to, working boards have the heaviest lift because you're doing all of the work. Governing boards kind of have a heavy lift, but typically it's more strategic level work. And so it's, really contemplating policies and concepts and budgets and direction and vision of the organization. An advisory board, you show up, somebody puts an idea in front of you, you give your gut reaction or a feedback on something that took place, and then you get to go home after lunch and just enjoy and let somebody else execute. The fundraising board, these can be a heavier lift, and certainly are a heavier lift on your pocketbook. A fundraising board is typically is all about being a resource to the organization for purposes of raising funds. These are primarily used in donor-based nonprofit organizations. So, for example, I was in a role that was a fundraising board role, and essentially staff cultivated the relationship with the donor and built it up and explained all the details about being a donor, and then would bring me along for lunch because I happen to know Joe from when I was in college, and Joe and I talk about our great days back in college so that Joe feels excited about opening his wallet and giving us money. That's really the key part of a fundraising board. The other piece of fundraising board is about financial responsibility and making sure that the funds that you raise, it's the fiduciary responsibility side of making sure you have duty of care, duty of loyalty, duty of confidentiality covered. And the last one, these are far more uncommon and are specific to certain industries, but a collective bargaining board. These are boards that exist primarily as the contact for when you have a collective bargaining agreement for membership base. So, for example, I have an organization that exists for the sole, all of their employees would all normally fall under a particular union. So they have 20 different companies. All of the employees of those companies would be part of a particular, in this case, like an electrical union, right? And so the companies join the association because the association is doing the collective bargaining agreement with that union. And so I get bargaining power with that union by being part of the larger association. So mostly that board is worried about fiduciary responsibilities. And sometimes those groups are doing educational programming and other value adds to bring things to their members. But mostly the board role is about the fiduciary responsibility part of things. In terms of the types of boards we see most often, the first three are probably the most common and the most critical to making sure that you have role clarity. In particular, understanding and defining whether you're supposed to be a working board or a governing board is really critical because it makes a difference on where your board members will spend their time. If I am a governing board, then I spend majority of my time on strategy, not on operations. If I'm a working board, I might well be the person that's actually reconciling the bank account because there's no staff to do that. So, right, that is a very different set to be in. It also, when you sit down to define your board roles, these three questions are some of the ones you really need to think about and be able to communicate to your volunteer board members. Because if I've worked for one organization and say 80% of my role as a board member was strategy and 20% was operations, but I step onto your board and 20% is strategy and 80% is operations, I'm going to quickly be like, you know what? This is not for me because I don't have time for operations. I have time to give strategy advice, right? So we have to make sure that's aligned, or else you have volunteers who volunteer who end up not enjoying their volunteer time because they thought they were going to give something different. On the same side, if I have a volunteer who really likes strategy and wants to volunteer on my board, maybe they're they're the attorney and they want to be able to talk strategy about like what the risk is to the organization, how to buffer that risk. And you suddenly ask that person, hey, can you make the posters for Friday night's casino night? They're not going to stay around very long, right? So we really have to think about aligning that as you think about what kind of board members you need. You also need to think about in terms of how much time a board member will spend on public representation. That's being the figurehead, right? When I was on one of my foundation boards, majority of my role was to show up and, as I used to say, shake hands and kiss the babies, right? Like that was my job, was to smile a lot and shake hands, and the staff walked along behind me and made sure that they were grabbing checks. That was all I needed to do. It's a very different role than the other foundation I served on where I sat, and literally we had to redefine the investment policy for the organization and figure out what that was going to look like. Two very different skill sets, two very different interests. And then the last piece is thinking about how much of their time will be spent executing tactics and activities, right? Are they the one making the posters? Are they the one balancing the checkbook? Or is this, right? You give your strategy, you make your votes, you follow governance, and then somebody else, like on staff, does all of the rest of the work. But if you can break this down for your board members and explain what percentage, if it adds up to 100, what percentage of my time is on strategy, what percentage of my time is public, like being the public face, and what percentage of my time is making posters, you'll get a much better alignment from your board, and you won't have situations where your board is doing work that maybe your staff should be doing. One of the reasons this makes a really big difference is actually starting with your executive director. So what type of board you are then dictates what type of executive director you might need. If you are, for example, a governing board and your board is intended to be strategic conversations and the executive director has staff that they can then delegate work to execute those strategies, then my executive director responsibilities look like those on the left, right? I'm spending time creating and implementing strategies. Largest portion of my time is being strategic and taking those strategies to the board. I'm obviously doing maybe 20% operations. I'm making sure organizational structure and work environment is going well. I'm making sure I'm doing all of the day-to-day management of the team. And then I'm also, making sure that I have financial oversight of the day-to-day. On the flip side, if I'm if I'm the executive director for a working board, this I always think of smaller nonprofit organizations, a chamber of commerce, where maybe you only have one or two staff members. Well, in this case, your executive director, if you only have one or two staff members, they're spending most of their time on administrative operations, making sure the bank account is reconciled, making sure the board packets are ready to go, executing on events, things like that. They're not going to have the bandwidth to be really strategic and visionary in the work. And so you first have to decide what kind of board are you so that you then know what kind of executive director do you need and where do you need that person to spend their time. I've seen organizations that want to be a working board, but then their executive director is really more administrative and operational, and they don't have the board just doesn't have the bandwidth to do the work that they need. On the flip side, I've seen smaller organizations decide, hey, we want to hire a really strategic executive director that can paint the vision and make all of these decisions, but nobody's there to make the full flyers for the event on Friday night or reconcile the checking account. And so marrying these two up becomes critical to success of the organization. From there, one of the things that we need to make sure that we do is design job descriptions. And this is where most folks tend to think of job descriptions simply as my staff all has job descriptions. But the reality of it is the roles within your governance model also need job descriptions. So your staff needs job descriptions, your board members need job descriptions, your committee chairs, and then your committee members. Because again, your volunteers are all well-intended and they want to do good. And most of us are used to being a volunteer in a working board situation. So that's how I know to operate. Well, if I'm supposed to be volunteering for a governing board and I'm a committee chair, I'm running around going, oh, I'm going to do all of the work. And the staff is standing back going, why is that person taking my job away? Or they didn't know these 10 things that they needed to know. And so it's super important that we have job descriptions that everyone has access to understand what are the roles and responsibilities at every level of the organization, both for staff and for volunteers. When we write these job descriptions, this is more than a laundry list of here's the 20 things you are responsible for doing. We always suggest thinking of job descriptions in terms of here are the top 3 to 5 priority areas for this particular role. Keep those at the high level. You can always add bullet points under them, but keep that at the highest of levels. Thinking about what percentage of somebody's time they will spend doing that particular part of the role so that there's an alignment. Because again, if I think I'm a working board, then the amount of time, the percentage of time that I think I'm going to spend planning events is different than what you think it should be if I'm supposed to be on a governing board. You can do sub-bullets of examples of tasks. That way that everybody is clear that we're all talking the same thing. And then you want to think about what are the skills and competencies needed for that role. That's particularly important because, right, like we think of boards oftentimes because it is whoever raised their hand. But if you can give some clarity to people that says like, here's what this should look like. You have a lot of volunteers that they want to be successful when they volunteer their time. So if it's not a good fit for them, then they might move along and go volunteer for another organization and they'll be happier and it will work more effectively for you. All of this helps board members and staff talk to each other about motivational fit because I'm giving my time to an organization, right? And I want that time to be used wisely. But if I volunteer and then I end up having to do a bunch of stuff I don't like, I'm going to burn out really quickly. So when we think about motivational fit, it's really about thinking about what does this person, like, what do you like doing and what do you dislike doing? And how often will you get to do it in this particular role? Which makes a ton of sense when we think about hiring staff, but we always forget to think about this when we're talking about where we volunteer our time. I just did a presentation for a board a couple of weeks ago, and it was really interesting. In the opening conversations, several people kept laughing when I asked the question, how did you get involved as a volunteer board member? Everybody just kind of chuckled and said, oh, I was voluntold that I needed to do this. And the word voluntold kept coming up over and over again. And it prompted a really interesting conversation about, did voluntold mean, well, they were interested in doing it and somebody just finally tapped them? Or did they get sort of appointed to something that they felt like they had to do versus something that they got to do? And when you think about motivational fit, right, if I like doing something and I get to do it a lot, then I get to do it. But if I dislike doing something and I have to do it a lot, I'm not as happy. So notice the difference between get to and have to. I am a perfect example that at this point in my career, if you ask me to be on a board of directors, my first question is this working board or governing board? Because I get to be on a governing board. I have to be on a working board. They're exhausting and they don't really fit into my schedule right now. So if I can align that, now you have board members who are really excited about the work that they're going to do. On the flip side, if I love being a working board member and you have me sitting around a table debating the financial investment policy for the organization, I'm going to be miserable. So you've got to make sure that there's a match here. And the great part is there's space for everyone in our volunteer world, but maybe that person should be a committee member and not a board member. And those are the kinds of distinctions you want people to be able to make. From there, that is going to help you absolutely align your selection criteria for your boards. Making sure that one, if there is sometimes you need technical knowledge, right? You need the attorney, you need the CFO, especially if it's a working board. That's something that like you need that person on your board to be able to play that role. And you'd better make sure you always have somebody in the queue to do it. On the flip side, if it's more of a governing board, then their technical skills are maybe far less relevant. And you may be more thinking about what are the competencies that I need this board member to have in order to be particularly effective. So for example, if I am a governing board, then one of the competencies that absolutely needs to be for every board member is strategic vision, because that's the number one goal of the governing board. So if you have a governing board of folks that don't have experience or understand that strategic vision work, they'll be struggling from the beginning to really understand what is their role, and they'll fight not being a working board on a regular basis. Also, organization experience can matter in some cases. There are plenty of boards out there that we actually may intentionally go find people who aren't part of the organization because we want outside perspective on the board. Other times, everybody on the board has been a part of the association or been involved in some way. There's not a right or wrong. It's really about making sure you've defined it clearly and intentionally to match the kind of board you need to be. From there, once we have those individual roles designed, then we start thinking about how do those roles come together. And this brings us to the concept of RACI charts. So RACI charts, right? Your job description is the piece of sheet music in front of every musician in the symphony that says, here's the notes you play and here's when you rest. On the flip side, the conductor stands in front and has a large piece of sheet music that says, this is when the woodwinds come in and this is when the percussion plays, and they can see the entire thing. The RACI chart is that conductor's music. And a RACI chart essentially defines for the most important parts of the board responsibilities who's responsible, meaning who's doing the work. Is it the working board member's responsibility to figure out the font size, or is there a staff member that's doing that, right? So who's doing the work? The second component to is who's the decision maker or the accountable. And there can only be one. So it's either the board or it's the executive director, or maybe it's the membership director, right? But it's one role. We can't all be final decision makers or we get gridlock. The consulted is who needs to be asked. Doesn't mean their opinion absolutely has to be the final decision, but we have to get their opinion before we move forward, right? And anything where, kind of going back to the accountable, if the board is accountable for something, then it very likely under governance requires a board vote. So you need an actual vote. If the board is consulted, then you might just put something out there, get asked for feedback, and then move on after seeing the feedback. But there's not an official vote if the board is simply consulted. And then the informed simply means you tell me that it happened. But, right, if I'm a board member and I think we should be accountable, and you think I should be consulted as a board member, I might think you blew governance, right? That you did something incorrect or did something outside of the scope of your fiduciary responsibility. And so it's important that we get a line on this so that both your board and your staff members understand their swim lanes, and all the way down to committee chairs, right? What can committee chair decisions, but what decisions can be made by a committee chair? What needs board approval before they start working on it, right? This is how committees go rogue and get a little wild, is if we're not clear here. These are a couple of examples of why RACI charts could matter and how they could look differently. This first sample is, for example, if we're planning an organization function, right? If we have an event coming up, and it outlines, right, that the vision for the function is set by the board. The board sets it, and the board is the final decision maker. The executive director may be consulted because it's vision, and members get informed. The budget, however, shifts, and now the budget, building the budget, is the executive director and the CFO or controller if you have it. The board, though, is ultimately the decision maker because if it's budget related, it has to be voted on by your board, right? So these are just some examples of how this works and where having clarity around these items could make a huge difference for you. On the flip side, right, if we're in a situation, and the first one was, so this is sort of conference planning. If you're in a governing board situation, this is how it would work, right? Selecting the date is going to be maybe your team member who is staff, right? So this is staff making all of those decisions. Boards may be accountable, but mostly these are staff roles because you have a governing board. On the flip side, same exact thing to be done in terms of planning the same activity, but in a working board, you're going to notice now the board roles or committee chairs are doing that work. And so there's a big difference if I think I'm joining a board that's a working board and I think I'm going to get to plan the events and pick the speakers and everything else. And it turns out this is a governing board and there's a staff member over there who's responsible for doing that. We're going to have a major problem when board member starts picking their own speakers and now we've double booked people, right? So giving everybody the clarity, I tell folks all the time, people volunteer their time because they want to do good in the world. Help set them up for success and feeling like that time was used in the best possible manner by being really clear on what's expected of them, because nobody wants to, none of us like to waste our time anyway, but we certainly don't want to do it in our volunteer space. The next piece of this is this concept of trust. So right now I have all these people and they have a good idea of what their role is, but we have to make sure there's enough trust that people can have the right conversations. And this becomes, as I said, super important because as board members, we don't interact every day. Sometimes we meet 4 times a year and we know nothing about one another. And so many times I see boards bring on a new person and we might go around the room and do introductions and tell everybody my name and where I live and what I do for a living. And that's it. And that's not enough trust for most people to engage in the conversations that you truly need to have happen. And it's why a board that maybe was supposed to be a governing board starts looking a little bit more like an advisory board. The other piece is, right, you're going to have, just like any team, you're going to have a lot of different personal styles. They're going to have a lot of different opinions on what their board role is. So if you've not given them clarity, you will have everybody will make it up themselves. And here's the biggest piece when it comes to nonprofit. People volunteer for things that they're really passionate about, right? Nobody volunteers for the thing that they don't care that much about. So they come with these passions and we're excited and we want to make a difference and we want to do good in the world. And then we start interacting with others and maybe we don't have the information we need. And the last one is, right, we need to give people the tools when you're on a board that they can differentiate between what was my intent and what was my impact. My intent can be fabulous, right? I can intend to do good for the organization, but if I keep doing staff's work for them or telling them how to get their job done, when it's not my role as a board member to do that, then my impact makes it look like I don't trust the staff or that I'm micromanaging. So my intent can be good, but my impact can be bad. And if we don't build trust, particularly between the board and the staff, it will cause us major challenges. This particular item is from Patrick Lencioni's Five Dysfunctions of a Team. This is one of my favorite books ever when it comes to how teams operate. But Lencioni talks about the fact that you have to have strong trust in order for any team to operate and have conversations that are considered healthy conflict. And healthy conflict is just good problem solving, right? This is not conflict like, ooh, we're going to say everything as raw as we can and offend each other. No. In fact, healthy conflict is being able to say the hard stuff without offending each other because we all trust enough that our intentions are to help support the organization and leave our personal advantages and ideas on, back home. When we do that, we get commitment, and commitment is particularly important with a board because it says, look, we're going to make some decisions, and sometimes the vote's not going to be unanimous. Sometimes I might have voted no on something that passed. I have to walk out of that room and support that vote, not in a, well, I'm supporting it, but I didn't vote for it, but in a, hey, we agreed as a board, and so we are all together in this as one. We also have to be able to hold each other accountable because at the end of the day, right, volunteer work, it's a side gig, and how do we make sure things get done? Also, we have to be able to hold staff accountable, and we also have to make sure staff knows that, right, board isn't going to be going around behind us going, yeah, you wouldn't believe how bad the staff was. Those kinds of things will tear boards down quickly. A couple of ways you can build trust. This is something we do a lot with teams, is just even getting people to understand one another. So self-reflecting and sharing vulnerabilities, things like everything DISC and understanding personal styles. We often think about these in the workplace, but we skip it when it comes to volunteer work. We're like, oh, that's fluffy stuff. We just need to get board work done. But in all reality, this becomes even more crucial when we don't spend as much time together. We have to understand how people approach the world and what they need to be operating at their most effective. And if we don't tell people the roadmap, then bad things can happen. The other piece, this is one of the exercises I love to do with boards because it makes a big difference on how we see the world, but it's called the Continuum of Trust. It comes from the book Speed of Trust, which has been around for decades, but it's all this idea of how quickly do I trust people and what does that look like? I did this with a board a couple of months ago, and it was really interesting because most of the board members were like an 8, 9, or 10, meaning they're slow to trust people and they reserve trust for a really small number of people. Most of the people in this board met each other that morning for the very first time. And that afternoon, they had to have a really important conversation about the long-term vision of the organization. Can you imagine having a really important conversation about the long-term vision of an organization with people that you don't trust? And it might not be that they did anything to break your trust. It's just not there yet. But how do you navigate that is really difficult. And so it was an aha moment for them that they were going to have to invest time in accelerating that speed of trust so that they didn't end up at the end of their 2-year term being like, wow, I trust you now, but we didn't get anything done because we couldn't agree on anything to pass through the board of directors. One of the other exercises, and this comes straight from Lencioni's work on trust, but this is the 3 questions. And the first 3 questions are ones that he has folks ask always. I've added on the question number 4 of share the moment you knew you wanted to be a volunteer leader for whatever organization. But getting people to talk about their passion and why it matters and why they're doing it immediately gives you a common bond and a common goal that can help accelerate trust very quickly for a board. The last component, so we had role clarity, we had trust, and our last component is this idea of healthy conflict, right? And that's really the second tier of your pyramid, but it's so critical. And not everybody is comfortable with conflict. There are some people that will have listened to this call and they're like, oh my gosh, she kept saying the conflict word. Why are we all in conflict? And conflict really is just the willingness to put all of our cards on the table, the willingness to say, I agree, or I disagree, or I didn't feel great about how that went the other day, right? And having that crucial conversation to make sure that we continue to build trust and we have alignment. Teams that won't engage in healthy conflict make decisions, and then everybody leaves the room and goes, that was dumb, but I didn't want to say it, so I'm not going to do it. Or they go and they hear something later on in the evening from somebody else in the organization. They're like, yeah, we decided that, but it wasn't my vote and I didn't like it, but I did it like we have to do it anyway, right? And so you have to understand for everybody on your team, how do they, like, where are they at on that scale of how comfortable they are with conflict? What do they view as acceptable and unacceptable behaviors in conflict? Because we all come from different backgrounds and might have different views of this. So this aligns our group norms and allows us to really understand how do we want to operate. Now, interestingly, some folks think of this in terms of like, oh yeah, this is what keeps our board from yelling at each other. But boards who also never voice an opinion and just go along with everything that an executive director said, it can be equally as damaging. I have a session next week with a board where the board it's supposed to be governing, but they really like their executive director. And so they've kind of slid into, oh, I guess they've got it. And they've kind of become advisory in nature. And that's lost the financial oversight that they actually need. And more importantly, just the broader fiduciary responsibility, which goes beyond just financial oversight. So this is about how do you want to define rules of the road for healthy conflict for your board. The beginning of every board term, we should go through this because every one of us has a different opinion about this. And if we assume everybody will come along, ultimately your culture starts to have cracks and we don't even know it. The other piece that is, important to define is what is the long-term goals for the organization? So it's 24 months from now and the organization is exceeding all of the goals. What have we accomplished? And how do we know we've accomplished it? This is a perfect example of visionary and strategic healthy conflict that allows us to think bigger picture and get involved in problem solving, but make sure that we're aligned while we're doing it. The other piece that I often will tell folks as you're rolling out things with the board, especially if people are used to being on working boards and you're trying to get them to be a governing board, we have to get really clear for people around what does problem solving actually look like. And most organizations start problem solving with this concept of, right, like, we skip right over what problem are we trying to solve and we go straight to what are the solutions. And then we sit around and we debate solutions. Great organizations actually start with alignment on what problem are we trying to solve, then deciding what are the decision criteria by which we're going to judge the possible solutions. And we align on decision criteria before we get into debating solutions and outcomes. Then we brainstorm possible options, we think through the pros and cons, and then we weigh those pros and cons against the decision criteria we originally aligned on. This can be really helpful in ensuring your board engages in healthy conflict to have meaningful conversations that allow people to speak their opinion without people feeling like, ooh, I'm attacking the person's idea, right? And so we're aligning around the problem and the decision criteria first, which means the ideas aren't personal. But if we don't align on the decision criteria, I might walk away thinking that cost and expense is the most important thing. And on the flip side, somebody else may be thinking, cost isn't important, but whether or not, if we're revamping our website and I'm a board member and I think cost is the most important criteria for which vendor we pick, but Luca thinks that the most important criteria is whether or not it matches our brand image, those are two very different answers as to which person we would pick. And so aligning on these first two criteria before you get into problem solving can ensure that your board has healthy conflict. Long story short, right? We've got 3 key areas that we've got to focus on in order to get your board to operate at its maximum potential. Role clarity, trust, and engaging in healthy conflict. And boards that do that well, first of all, get amazing results. But more importantly, they have volunteers who absolutely sing the praises of the organization and feel like that volunteer time was worth it. I always share I had an experience with a board that I served on, and the first 2 years that I served on the board, none of those things were in place. We did not have role clarity. Board members were tripping over each other. Board members were tripping over staff all of the time. Staff felt offended. We didn't have trust, right? Because of all of those things. And when we got to board meetings, it felt like everybody was walking on eggshells, and you'd be like, I know this isn't great, but I don't know if I should speak out. I don't know if my opinion is going to be embraced, right? And you just walked away from meetings feeling like, oh, I survived that. We got through, but I don't think we're doing our best work. Fast forward a few years, we spent time as a board getting role clarity and putting RACI charts in place for the staff. All of that built great trust with the staff, that everybody knew whose swim lane was what and how we were going to operate. And when things got confusing, we just picked up the phone and had a conversation, right? We would go to board meetings and we were aligned on the longer term vision. We did really cool stuff as a board of giving the direction they needed for the staff to be really, really effective. And board meetings were fun. They were productive, and you felt like you really made the impact you had hoped to make. At the end of the day, I got done with the last 2 years. I served for almost 7 years on that organization. And my last 2 years, it was finally time to be done. And I was like, kind of don't want to go. Like, this is really fun. And I'm really proud of the work that we did. And we had this bench strength behind us of other people that not only wanted to be board members, but understood what it meant to be a board member. So now there's a succession plan in place for everybody behind us. So you don't have to volunteer for the same organization in the same role for 10 years, right? So really important things that can make all the difference in your success as a board. I love to share these things with you all. I will share the recording after everybody is set up. And also, if you aren't already on our a member of our newsletter information, you obviously always have access to, if you use this QR code, you can get a copy of our HR playbook, which can be really helpful to help your team think about what does this look like. And we will always book a free HR strategy session for folks that are not clients of ours today. So the clients get free strategy sessions all of the time. So I'm going to go ahead and